Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Vovchansk, and in this one we start out in the Kharkiv direction, where the Russians continue their assault and storming of Vovchansk, where they are now attempting to cross the river, and fighting has been reported in the fire station across the river line. We see that the Russians have been pressuring the Ukrainian positions north of the Vovchansk River for a long time now, and the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians mostly towards the riverbank, with just a small area here in between the Ukrainian positions and the river in the northern part of Vovchansk. The Russians have successfully managed to push to the western parts of the river line and now are attempting crossings across, which has succeeded in part as Russians have crossed over and fighting has started across the river line. However, it is unclear if they've managed to gain a foothold and stabilize a crossing, or it is simply an incursion with some reconnaissance. The fighting here taking place and the Russians crossing over in the Vovchansk river line is significant, as the crossing would mean that the Russians would be across the river line and fighting can start in the southern parts of Vovchansk, which has largely only been demolished by artillery and other long-range weaponry so far, and no direct fighting until the fighting has reached the firefighting building. So we see that the Russians are continuing their operations here in the Vovchansk direction, and they are attempting to cross the river line as they are nearing the end of the fighting in the northern section of the town. The Ukrainians are considerably sending reinforcements to the area, where they are attempting to not only gather enough forces to hold the positions, but it is also reported that in the direction of Lypky that the Ukrainians have attempted counterattacks to try and push the Ukrainians back from the town, as the Russians have started storming it following their assaults to reach the outskirts of it. So with this we see that positional fighting is taking place here in the west, which is why there's been a lack of advances by the Russians for the past few days compared to the Vovchansk area, as the Ukrainians have gained enough troops here in the area to start counterattacking. However, this has only changed the situation to become a stalemate rather than the Ukrainians recapturing territory or the Russians continuing on. It's unclear exactly how this will develop, and we'll see that the Russians will continue to increase the pressure here in this section of the front line, as Lypky is as important a target for the Russians as Vovchansk is to the east. According to reports, the Russian positions in Lypky, if they manage to gain control of it, would allow direct view of Chasiv Yar here at the northern microdistrict of the city of Kharkiv with the naked eye. This means that Russian artillery, while being within range of the northern outskirts of Kharkiv, would also be able to directly look at the Ukrainian positions, allowing for detection of the Ukrainian forces in the area and hitting them directly with artillery fire. Further south in the direction of the Chasiv Yar microdistrict and area, the Russians have stormed Kalinina and have gained a foothold on the eastern outskirts of the village. This is following the Russian capture of Robotyne and a push through towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the north. This has allowed the Russians, in combination with their assaults to the south, to reach Kalinina, and now fighting is taking place within the village. If the Russians gain control over Kalinina, they'll start pushing towards the south through the forest patches down to the micro district where fighting is taking place. We see it in this video here of the Chasiv Yar micro district, where the Russians are heavily bombarding the Ukrainian positions in the area. So a lot of smoke is rising. The perspective is here to the east and towards the southern parts of the micro district. There's also this video here where the Russians yet again are filming the destruction in the micro district of Chasiv Yar, where we see that the first few buildings are completely destroyed, and most of them are, except for the apartment complexes, where some are more damaged than others, but smoke is constantly rising from all of the shelling. At the same time, the Russians have also reportedly attempted crossings here in the southern flank towards the main parts of Chasiv Yar, where we see this drone footage here of the main parts also being massively destroyed, and a lot of smoke rising on a constant basis from all of the artillery shelling hitting the areas. We see that the field is completely littered with these holes from artillery shelling. Moving further south here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have attacked both in the western and northern parts of the city. In the western parts, the Russians have managed to capture the western outskirts of it. There is this small area here remaining under Ukrainian control north of the lake south of Krasnohorivka, and there's also fighting over this farm area west of Krasnohorivka. But other than that, the Russians have gained control over the entirety of the southern and western parts here in the central area of Krasnohorivka. In the northern parts, the Russians have restarted assaults here in the northeast, where they're pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications in the area to gain full control of it. And with this, we see that the Ukrainians are in their final fortifications to the northeast of the city. Following that, the Russians will be able to flank the Ukrainian positions by attacking in the northern parts of Krasnohorivka to completely avoid the northern residential area from the central parts, and this could be combined with an assault in the western parts to kind of attack in a pincer maneuver the northern parts of Krasnohorivka. This would force the Ukrainians to withdraw from the northern parts to the outskirts of Krasnohorivka, or simply to hold on and avoid a Russian breakthrough in these areas. In either case, it seems that the Russians are developing the situation in Krasnohorivka and are likely going to restart offensive operations to gain control over larger areas and end the Battle of Krasnohorivka. As I've previously mentioned in a previous analysis, with the Russians gaining control over the industrial area and the high-rise areas in the central parts of the city, the Ukrainian positions within it are very difficult to hold on to. The normal residential buildings are very vulnerable to artillery fire, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to their positions. And in the northern parts, there is mostly just dacha area and normal residential areas that are widely spread around, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to these positions, which means that the only real position the Ukrainians are really holding on to is the central parts or northern parts of Krasnohorivka, and then the outskirts, of which all of these are vulnerable positions for Russian artillery fire. This means the longer the Ukrainians hold on to these positions, the more casualties they're going to take from the heavy shelling of the Russians. Further south here in the direction of Novomykhailivka, the Russians have pushed a slight bit in a western direction. This is in the direction of Konstantinivka and the road between Konstantinivka and Volodar. The Russians are here doing a similar thing as they were doing in the direction of Novomykhailivka, where they will approach the town of Konstantinivka from the southern and eastern directions. For this, positional fighting has started, where the Russians are attempting to get closer to the town by pushing through the forest lines and fields south of it. Further south here in the direction of Robotyne, the Russians have pushed further north, attacking the final Ukrainian defensive positions within Robotyne and reaching the outskirts of the village. With this, the battle over the final parts of Robotyne has begun, and the Russians will likely capture the final parts of the village within the next few days or this following week, and that will allow the Russians to regain full control of Robotyne. The Russian Ministry of Defense has already claimed that they have control of it, but they do not, as the Ukrainians still have positions in the fortified positions in the northern outskirts of the village and eastern outskirts of it, both the one here to the east and the ones to the north. And heavy fighting continues over these positions. And with that, we see that all of the frontline updates have been covered. We do, however, have some additional information, and that is number one, there has been a truckers' protest in Odessa. We have this footage here showing these protests. It is reportedly that this protest took place due to the new mobilization law that is very strict for the Ukrainians, and these truckers believe that their work is already essential for what Ukraine is going through in this war. Yet the new mobilization law allows the Ukrainian TCC officers to mobilize truckers while they are working, really, to send them the request to file for updating their military register and going for mobilization. At the same time, we see in most areas in southern Ukraine, including Odessa, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, and other areas here in southern and eastern Ukraine, most areas are completely empty. We see this video here. This is the beaches in Odessa, and it is completely empty of all people. There are very few instances of people going by where this place is usually crowded, and that's why he shows his watch. It's like, this is a normal time for crowds to be here, but it's completely empty. So we see that the mobilization right now in Ukraine is extremely intense. According to my sources, most Ukrainian men don't even go outside their houses for weeks or months at a time to completely avoid the mobilization. Everyone needs to update their register for them to be mobilized, and that is being avoided. But now there's a deadline to it, and if you go over that deadline, there will be fines. So economically, you'll have issues if this continues. So far, the Ukrainian men are trying to avoid it and delay it as much as possible because they are mobilizing pretty much everyone. And the worst part of it is that the ones being mobilized are at this point the least trained and worst equipped Ukrainian soldiers since the start of the war. It's reported that a Ukrainian person, civilian, goes to the mobilization office, gets mobilized, and within a week goes to the front and gets back because he's wounded. That is the current situation. That is, of course, a singular, nitpicky story, but that's the point. The Ukrainian civilians do not receive more than a week before reaching the front. That is due to the lack of reserves in the Ukrainian army. It is currently reported that about 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers are available to fight at the front, and all of them are dedicated to the front, leaving no one in reserve. There's no significant reserve. Even the GRU is being sent to the front in Kharkiv to try and stabilize the front line. And this is why the mobilization is extremely intense right now for the Ukrainians. Pretty much anyone and everyone is taken from the list of viable candidates, and this is why everyone within military age is avoiding as much as possible to go outside because they fear going to the front would just get them offed. And I'll end this video on that note. This is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.